This is what happens when you're trying not to connect with reality. So I'm going to have to split up my wrap up for January and my TBR for February. Last month I was able to put them all together in one nice neat little video. This month that is just not possible. So in January I had a really great reading month, much better than most reading months I've ever had. I think it's the second most I've ever read in a month. The first most was like a couple of years ago in February when I read over 20 books in a month. I didn't quite read 20 this month, but I did get pretty close. So in the month of January, the beginning of 2022, I read 15 books. This was possible for a lot of different reasons that I don't need to totally go into, but just know that a lot of the contribution to this number was the audiobooks that I listened to. I am a huge audiobook listener. I love them so much. I use Hoopla, Libby, Libro FM, Audible, literally anywhere that you could get an audiobook. I have the app for it, except for the other one, Scribd. I don't use Scribd. Anyway, with that whole spiel out of the way, I do want to get into this because, like I said, 15 books, it's going to take a while. The first book that I read in the month of January was Love, Chai, and Other Four-Letter Words by Anika Sharma. So this kind of started off my huge romance reading month this month. I read so many romance books and I ended up liking most of them. This one was a 3-star for me. I enjoyed it. There were definitely a lot of elements that I found super entertaining in this book, but overall I just didn't really love it the way that I loved all the other romance books that I read this month. I think one of my critiques for the book was that it felt a little too unrealistic, and that's not me necessarily saying that all romance that I read has to be realistic, because let's just be real, most romance isn't realistic. It definitely can have elements of realism, but most of it is just going to be very fictionalized and very exaggerated in a way. But that was just one of the critiques that I had for that book. And I also felt like there were some like story elements that didn't really do it for me. But overall, I did really enjoy the book. I highly recommend it. It was just kind of like a fun read for me. The next 2 books are part of a romance trilogy, and the first one that I read was Take a Hint, Danny Brown by Talia Hibbert, and I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. So I read Get a Life, Chloe Brown last year, and I absolutely loved it, and I had kind of put off the rest of the series mainly because I was like, how is she going to top this book? I loved Chloe's story. I loved Chloe as a character. I really connected with her. And I wasn't sure if I would connect with the next sister, Danny, as much as I did with Chloe. So I was a little worried that it might not work for me. But at the beginning of this month, I decided to give Danny's book a chance, and I absolutely loved it. It was so much fun. It was so much more steamy than the first book. I feel like this is definitely the most like sexy out of the entire trilogy. So if that's what you're looking for, highly recommend the second book. Danny is such like a fun, interesting, eccentric character, and I love that she's like in academia. She's super smart, but she's also like not looking for anything serious. She's definitely just looking for like hookups. That's kind of what she's into at the moment, and that's what's kind of been the downfall for a lot of her past relationships, is that she doesn't want to be as serious as her partner wants to be. But the entire catalyst for the story is basically that Danny gets saved from this like fake drill. What are those called? Like a routine drill. It's not real. A practice drill. You know what I mean? I don't know if it's a fire drill or not, or what it is, but it's some sort of like drill that you do at school. And her friend, who's a security guard at the school, goes in and like saves her, and it goes viral because somebody films it and puts it on the internet, and everybody is like in love with this like couple that she and the security guard are, but it's not real. But in order to kind of get some good publicity specifically for the love interest, they decide to go ahead with this fake relationship. I think what Talia Hibbert does so well, especially within this series, because these are the only books I've read from her, I love the chemistry that she creates between these two characters. I believe every single relationship that she puts out there, it it might not be like fully realistic, but I 100% believe it, and that's what I really love about her books, specifically within this series. And I definitely want to branch out and read other Talia Hibbert books, so if there are any that like you specifically love, let me know down below in the comments, because I am 100% on board. The next book that I read was also part of the series, and that is Act Your Age, Eve Brown by Talia Hibbert, and I gave this a 5 out of 5 stars. It's definitely my favorite from the trilogy. I absolutely loved this book. It had everything that I could have ever wanted. It was so good. The chemistry between the two main characters were just phenomenal. It was phenomenal. It was so well done. I loved Eve so much. I loved Jacob so much. When I was reading this book, I was like screaming. I literally read it in one sitting. I read this book in one sitting, in one night. I started it at around like 6 or 7 at night, and I finished it like at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. It was so good. I loved this book. I loved it so much. Jacob, I just fell in love with him. When I was listening to the audiobook, I was like screaming. I was like, I could love him. I could love him. He's just like on the list of like my favorite literary like book boyfriends. I have so many. And he's another one of those like male characters that I tend to relate to really well. I loved him. I loved him so much. He was just everything to me. And I also loved that there is autistic rep within this book. I have not been diagnosed with autism, but for me, I really connected with these characters so much on such like a deep level. That's why it's my favorite out of the trilogy. I loved Eve so much. I could 100% relate to her on so many levels. It was scary. She is the youngest out of the Brown sisters, and she has not really been able to hold down like a secure job, and she is currently unemployed. Join the club. She ends up getting into kind of an argument with her parents and runs away, and in the process of running away, she comes across this bed and breakfast that is currently hiring, and she hasn't put in an application. They don't know that she's coming, but she decides to go and interview anyway. And Eve and Jacob, who runs the bed and breakfast, they don't really get along at first. He's not really into her. They kind of banter a little bit back and forth, and then she decides to leave and kind of goes into her car and like is thinking about everything. I can't remember if she's crying or not. If it was me, I'd be crying. And when she decides to leave, she accidentally runs over Jacob, and he breaks his arm. So she kind of gets into a deal with his best friend, who's kind of like a co-owner of the bed and breakfast, that she will work as the cook, which is the open position. And it kind of goes from there. It's a little bit of a hate to love, but I don't think it's like a serious hatred. It was just like kind of like they butt heads a little bit. But I loved it. It was so good. The chemistry was there. I loved the characters. The story was so much fun. The romance was so much fun. So yeah, I absolutely loved that book. The next 2 books that I read are also part of a series, a different series obviously, and that is Dark of the West by Joanna Hathaway. Oh my god, another series that I absolutely fell in love with. I am so obsessed. Basically, this is a YA semi-historical fantasy. It's kind of difficult because it's not necessarily historical in the way that it's not set within our world. So it's not like real history, but it definitely has those historical elements. And then it's also not quite fantasy because it's not like there's magic and dragons or whatever. It's just a, I guess you would say like a secondary world fantasy. It's very parallel to our own world, but it's not necessarily our world. But basically this historical fantasy has airplanes and pilots and princesses and stuff like that. It's really fun. I kind of described it as Star Wars meets Romeo and Juliet. It definitely has a lot of elements from both of those stories. This book is almost like beat for beat Romeo and Juliet. So if you're looking for a really fun, well, I guess it's not super fun. It's not like fun in like a lighthearted way. It's just more fun in like a Star Wars-y way. It's so good, I swear. And not a lot of people have talked about this book. Not a lot of people have read it. I mean, if we're gonna go on to Goodreads and see how many people have rated it, only 1,500 people have rated this book. So it's highly, highly underhyped. So underhyped. But it's 100% worth it to check it out, at least in my opinion. I loved this book. It was so much fun. And you know me, I love Star Wars, I love Romeo and Juliet, so it was completely up my alley. And historical fantasy is one of my favorite subgenres of all time. I will read any historical fantasy that you throw at me. I will be so excited to read it. This book, it just owns me. It owns me and my entire soul. Also, it is a little mature, I will say. The main characters are both 18 throughout the series, so it is a little bit mature. It's on the more mature YA side. I don't think I mentioned how much I gave this book. I gave it a 4.5 stars, and the only reason I took off a half star is because there's a bit of info dumping, and it was a little slow in the beginning, so I kind of felt like it didn't fully deserve a 5 stars, but in my heart, it's a 5 stars. The next book that I read was also from that series, and that is Storm from the East by Joanna Hathaway, and this is the one I gave 5 out of 5 stars, like a full 5 out of 5. It was absolute perfection. So I can't talk about this one too much, but I do feel like it's a huge improvement from the first book. Even though the first book was like so good, nearly perfect, this second book was just everything. It was so immersive. And I really loved the character development that happened in this book. Sometimes I feel like authors will use the second book to kind of separate the characters, and that's going to be the conflict. The conflict is solely the separation of these two characters. But the conflict within this second book is not just the fact that they're separated, but that they inherently change as people. And that kind of throws a wrench into their relationship. They have to kind of relearn each other and re-meet each other, and it's not the same as it was in the first book. I think that that's really realistic, is that like when you are separated from another person, even if you loved each other, even if you had this amazing relationship, if you are separated from each other for a long time, and you're especially, you know, going through a lot of these like political things that are happening, you're gonna change as people. Like, that's just how it's gonna be. And it might work for the better, or it might not work at all. And I think that that was a really interesting thing to explore within the second book. So that's why it worked for me personally. And I really love this series. I highly recommend it. It's not going to be for everybody, but if you like historical fantasy, this might be perfect for you. The next book that I read was one that I actually read physically, and that is Franny and Zoe by J.D. Salinger. I ended up giving this book a 3 out of 5 stars, and it's not because I didn't like it. It's just because I don't think that J.D. Salinger is necessarily the writer for me. Is he a good writer? Yes, I will give him that, but I don't think that his books are for me. I was going to try to reread The Catcher in the Rye, but after reading Franny and Zoe, I kind of decided that I don't really want to do that. I mean, never say never, but I just don't see myself going and picking up The Catcher in the Rye anytime soon. I will say that I did like this book in a weird way. It's basically a combination of these two short stories. Well, a short story and a novella. Franny is the short story, Zoe is the novella. I did really like Franny's short story, so it started off pretty strong. But it wasn't until I got to Zoe where I was like, I don't know if this is for me. It is very drawn out. Basically, Zoe's novella is like centered all around this conversation in the bathroom between Zoe and his mother, and it takes forever. It lasts forever, and I was just like, really? Can we get out of this bathroom? I was getting upset the way that Zoe was getting upset. I'm like, when is this conversation going to end? It was dragging on. It was so repetitive, and I was just like, okay, we get it. We honestly get it. At this point, we got it. We got it. Yeah, his mom is really annoying. We understand. I did feel like it kind of redeemed itself in the end. I really liked kind of the switcheroo that it does. I don't want to give any spoilers. I mean, I know this book has been out for literally ever, but I do think that it's really fun to go into it and not really know what to expect. Basically, this book follows the Glass family. That I am aware that J.D. Salinger wrote a lot about this fictional Glass family. And the Glass family is a Jewish family that is living in New York, and they have quite a few children who were extremely smart as children. So they were on this radio show that featured very intelligent children. I can't remember what it was called. It was something, but it's a big deal within this story specifically. So a lot of what these two stories talk about is a lot of the pressure that these kids faced. So it deals a lot with that, and I don't really want to talk too much about it because I think that despite the fact that I don't think that J.D. Salinger is my kind of writer, it did have a lot of things to say, and it had a lot of really great conversations. So I do highly recommend it if you're looking for a classic that is going to be super short, really fast, and interesting. Highly recommend it. I did also really enjoy the family dynamics within this book, so yeah, I mean, it was fine. It was a 3-star. I liked it, I didn't like it. It was all kind of over the place. The next book that I read was Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism by Amanda Montell, and I gave this also a 3 out of 5 stars. So I was really excited to read this book. I think that Amanda Montell might have been on the You're Wrong About podcast. I might be wrong, I'm not sure. Future Allie will double check that, but I have been wanting to read this book for quite a long time. I have a really big interest in cults and stuff like that, so I felt like I would really enjoy this book. And I will say that it is a very easy read / listen. I did listen to the audiobook and I did really enjoy the audiobook, but I will say that I feel like this is better suited for people who don't really have an understanding of what a cult is and how they operate and stuff like that. I think it'd be really good for a beginner. I am definitely not a beginner. I have been really interested in cults for, I would say, the past decade at least. So I have a lot of information under my belt. So this was kind of a regurgitation of a lot of the things I already knew. It doesn't really go very deep into cults or into how they operate or into how they affect our society. It really focuses a lot more on like pop culture cults, such as Scientology. It also touched a little bit on Lululemon, and it also touched on Peloton, I'm pretty sure, and some other like cycling and athletic things as well. So it wasn't necessarily focusing on like these really serious cults. It was definitely more of like the pop culture aspect of cults. I felt like there's a lot of potential to have a really good conversation about how cults negatively and directly affect especially our political atmosphere. We're definitely seeing that with the widespread book bannings that are happening at the moment that are definitely fueled by evangelicalism. So I felt like there's definitely a lot of room to talk about that, but it wasn't spoken about, so that's totally fine. So yeah, I feel like it's a really fun read. If you're interested in it, I highly recommend it, but it's definitely not going to go super deep into the topic of cults. The next book that I read was Winter Song by S.J. Jones, and I gave this a 2 out of 5 stars. At first I did give it a 3 out of 5, but you know, after I took a few days to kind of let it set in, it was definitely more of a 2 out of 5 book for me. I'm starting to realize that I don't have a huge interest in reading fantasy books about goblins. I feel like this is the second or third goblin book that I've read, and I haven't liked any of them. So I might not be a goblin girl. I think that this book is really interesting, and I don't think it's a bad book at all. It just wasn't the right book for me. The writing style didn't connect with me. The main character felt very like early 2010s, if you know what I mean. She was so obsessed with how ugly she was. Every single page she was just like, I am so ugly and disgusting. I am a disgusting excuse for a human being. I'm so ugly. It's so gross. Ew, I'm ugly. Like, she literally hyper focused on how ugly she was. And I'm just like, do we care? Like, just be ugly. Accept it. Embrace it. Let's love how ugly you are. I've definitely read books with ugly main characters, and I love them. I love an ugly main character. Ugly or even like real ugly. I think it's so much fun. I mean, one of my favorite books is Anti-Darken by Kirsten White, and Lada is canonically ugly. It's part of the plot, and she embraces it. It's part of her strength, how ugly she is. ugly. I don't even think, like, the way that they describe Lotta, she's not necessarily like ugly, she's just not like conventionally attractive. But it's part of her strength. It's part of what makes her badass. That could have been the case in Winter Song. Like, this main character had the room to be badass. And, like, not that every female character needs to be badass, needs to, you know, be, like, this strong female character, but it just felt really annoying. It was just grating on me how much she, like, focused on how ugly she was. And I wouldn't have minded it if she had mentioned it a couple of times throughout the book. That's totally fine. We can all have our insecurities, right? But it just felt like a little much. It felt like too much. In my opinion. I didn't love this book. It wasn't really for me. I don't really like goblins. I don't know, they just, it's offsetting to me. Off-putting, offsetting, I don't know. Either way, didn't like it. So, I am interested in reading other S.J. Jones books because I think that she's a really good writer, but there's a lot of elements that just didn't work for me. The next book I absolutely loved, and that was If This Gets Out by Sophie Gonzalez and I'm trying to remember the name before it loads. No, Cultish. So this is one of those rare occurrences where I actually really love the fact that it was co-written, and I couldn't even tell that it was co-written. It was so good. I gave this book a 4 out of 5 stars. I think I took off a star because there was just some like weird elements to me that didn't really like feel right, but that's just me. I absolutely loved this book. This is a YA contemporary romance, and it follows a boy band, and they are kind of like a manufactured boy band a little bit. They all met at summer camp, but when they got signed, they had to kind of tailor their sound to fit the image of what the record label wanted. They're not really playing the kind of music that they love. But like I said, it's a boy band and they are going on tour, and one of the members is closeted. He is gay, but the record label is like, not right now. Maybe later, but not right now. Which, okay, whatever. But he ends up developing a crush on one of his bandmates. And it's a dual perspective book. I loved that about it because I loved both of the boys. I think that they're amazing. I loved all of the boys in the boy band, which is really important for me, especially when it's a boy band. I need to love every single character. I need to love them all. I need to fall in love with them and just like adore them as like cute little like boy band members. I mean, I grew up with boy bands. I grew up, you know, when I was very little, there was NSYNC, Backstreet Boys when I was like 4 or 5. And then once I got into middle school, it was Jonas Brothers, and then high school is One Direction. So I like, boy bands are just part of my DNA. I also love the bisexual rep in this book. I felt like it had a little bit of a rocky start, but it really made up for it in the end. And I loved this book so much. The chemistry was there, just like everything about it worked for me, and it was just a lot of fun. So I highly recommend this book. It's so cute, and yeah, go read it. It's really good. The next book I absolutely loved. It was so amazing. I think I read it in like one day too, and that was the Bromance Book Club by Lyssa Kay Adams. Oh my gosh. So I was asking for recommendations for books, like specifically romance books that have baseball within them, and this was one of the recommendations, and I was like, okay, I've heard a lot of good things about this book. I had no idea that it had anything to do with baseball, so I'm really excited. If you didn't know, I am a huge baseball fan. I am a lifelong fan of the Angels, the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim. They are my team. They're not very good, but I love them anyways. So I am a baseball girly. So I was really excited to find a book that kind of centered around baseball. It's not a huge element within this book, but it's definitely there. And it follows this, you know, big baseball player. He's in the major leagues, and his marriage is on the rocks. Like, his wife is currently asking for a divorce. And it's all because, well, it's not all because, I mean, there's very many reasons for the divorce, but she has never experienced an orgasm throughout their marriage. So that's a very big contributing factor. And when he finds this out, he is pretty devastated. So his teammates bring him into this romance book club that they have, this secret book club, and are determined to help him save his marriage. So I absolutely loved this book. I was a little surprised that it was dual perspectives. I had no idea, but I ended up actually really liking both of the perspectives of the Major League Baseball player and his wife. It just worked so well for me, and I loved their dynamic. I also really loved getting to read a book, like a romance book, that was between characters that were already married. Like, that is really cool. I don't feel like I've read really any romance books between a married couple. So that was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that book. I highly recommend it. 5 out of 5 stars. It was so much fun. We're almost to the end. We have 3 more books to talk about. This is gonna be the longest wrap up. Oh my gosh, I'm already tired. I thought I was gonna film another video today, but I don't know if that's gonna happen. The next book I read was a pretty big disappointment. I did end up DNFing it, but I got 3/4 of the way through it, so I felt like I can kind of count it, and that is Fable by Adrienne Young. This is another case of, I think I don't like books that are solely set on the sea, ocean, pirate books. I have read a pirate book in the past that I loved, but that's kind of been an anomaly. I've read other pirate books that I did not like, so I'm a little disappointed because it's funny, one of my work in progresses, like the only one that I've truly finished, part of it does take place on the ocean, but I feel like my issue is I don't want it to like 100% take place on the ocean on a boat. It's just boring to me. So yeah, I was really disappointed with this book. I think it's like a really interesting book. Also, look at, can I put it? No, her face is a little too big. Yeah, a little too big. I do think that this definitely has its audience. If you love pirates, if you love pirate books, this is for you. My biggest complaint with this book is that there was no chemistry. There was no romance. I mean, it really tried to shoehorn a romance in there, but I did not believe it. Not for a second. Not for a gosh darn second. Let's see if I have something to say in my review. I'm sure I do. It might be a little bit more articulate. I said, I couldn't, okay, it's not that much more articulate. I couldn't take it anymore when he made this huge deal about not getting to be with her and how much he loved her when there has been absolutely no chemistry. The narrative keeps telling me that there's something between them, but I haven't seen it yet. That was my huge problem with this book. I mean, a bad romance within a book can completely ruin it for me, because I would rather there be no romance than a bad romance. In the words of Lady Gaga, they were caught in a bad romance. One of my favorite Lady Gaga songs, honestly. But I just didn't buy it. You know what I mean? Like, there are some romances where it just doesn't make sense. There was no interaction between these characters. And I guess there was supposed to be this history between them where he was kind of looking out for her on the down low. They had like had these interactions in the past, but this all happened off screen. This all happened off page. Like, you don't get to see these interactions between them. You just get told that they happened. And that's a big problem for me. I'm not always strict on the show don't tell thing, but with a romance, I feel like it's kind of necessary to show that there's like actually like this really good thing going on between them. Because if there isn't, it just kind of feels like it popped out of nowhere, right? And also another big problem with this book is that nothing exciting happens. I'm 3/4 of the way through this book and nothing has happened. Nothing has happened. It felt like it was a huge build up to the second book. I'm sure that the second book is super fun, super exciting, all this plot stuff happens. But in this book, it really, I feel like it could have been condensed to like the intro for the second book. It could have just been one big book instead of like 2 smaller books. It didn't work for me, unfortunately. There's so many problems I had with this book. I gave it a 2 out of 5 stars. If that tells you anything. I did not like it. It's not going to be staying on my bookshelves, which is great because I need to get rid of some books. Oh my gosh, I totally skipped over 2 books. I don't know why I did that. Okay, I also read Dare to Be a Duchess by Sapna Bog, and I gave this book a 5 out of 5 stars. It was incredible. I love historical romance. I love historical romance, and I didn't realize how much I loved it until recently. I think what really sold it for me was last year, I think it was last year, when I read The Heiress Gets a Duke by Harper St. George. I loved that book. It was so good. And I read the sequel to that book. I loved it. And it's definitely convinced me of how much I love historical romance. So when I read Dare to Be a Duchess, I was so excited. It was so good. I love that it has an Indian main character, and she just absolutely shined in this book. I loved her. I fell in love with her. She was so much fun. She kind of had this like interesting twist between like a Jo March, a Rapunzel, kind of like that vibe mixed together, and it was so much fun. I absolutely loved it. I definitely want to read more historical romance, and I want to read more like diverse historical romance. So if you have any recommendations, leave them down below. I am going to read a Beverly Jenkins book this month, so I'm really excited about that. But yeah, I love historical romance, and it was so much, oh, I just loved it. There were so many good elements. It's definitely a book that I want to reread. Like, I could reread it right now and have so much fun. The next book that I accidentally skipped over was The Hate Project by Chris Ripper, and I gave this, I think, a 4 out of 5 stars, right? Yeah, 4 out of 5 stars. I really liked it. It's a queer romance. It's a Killian romance, male-male romance. So good. So good. So queer. So much fun. I loved it. It was so good. I had so much fun reading it. It's very, very spicy. So it immediately starts off with the spice. So if you're into that, 100% check it out. It's really good. Definitely a goal for me this year is to read more male-male romance. Definitely haven't read enough of it. That's kind of why I decided to read The Hate Project, and also If This Gets Out. I'm trying to do better on that. I read a lot of sapphic romance. I read a lot of sapphic books in general, but Achillean books, as they are called, not really as much. So it's definitely an area where I need to improve. Okay, so I'm down to my last 2 books. I ended up reading Normal People by Sally Rooney, and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. I am fully obsessed with that book. So obsessed. I read Conversations with Friends last year, and I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars. I was super disappointed, but it was her first book, so I guess I should have known. And then I'd also watched a little bit of the original series for Normal People, and I wasn't super into it. It didn't really work for me all that much. So I kind of thought that Normal People just wasn't going to be the book for me. I was so wrong. I was so wrong. I'm eating my words. I loved Normal People. It was so good. I was not expecting it, and maybe that's why I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars, is that it surprised me. So I wasn't really expecting for it to be as good as it was, but oh my gosh, Marianne and Connell, 2 new favorite characters. 2 new favorite characters. I love them. Connell, oh, he's my baby. He's my little baby. And then Marianne, just so sad to me. Like, I was so sad for her. That book definitely made me cry a little bit. I have to admit. I didn't really cry very much this month over the books that I read, but these last 2 books, these were criers. I loved it. It was so good. I highly recommend Normal People. I can't really explain what it's about because it doesn't really have a plot. It's very character driven. So if you are into character driven novels, highly recommend it. Do not watch do not watch the original series for Normal People before reading the book. I made that mistake. Don't do it. Watch it after you read the book. Okay, so the very last book that I read for the month of January, probably one of my favorites of the month, and that was Honey Girl by Morgan Rogers. I gave this a 5 out of 5 stars. If I could have, it would be a 10 out of 10. It was such a good book. I cried so much when reading that book. There were so many, like, I don't know if it was intentional, but there were so many, like, very subtle Taylor Swift references in that book, and it just got to me. It really did. And I could so highly relate to the main character of Honey Girl, Grace. She just, I relate to that. I relate to that very highly. She is this like overachiever. She has parents, or has a dad that really puts a lot of pressure on her to like be the best, be strong all the time, and it is really weighing on her heavily. And when she ends up not getting the opportunities that she expected to get after finishing her doctorate, she is just kind of like feeling very directionless and like doesn't know what to do. But she also goes to Las Vegas to celebrate her doctorate, and when she's there, she ends up getting married. She's very drunk and she ends up marrying this girl that she meets in Las Vegas, and that's kind of what happens. Like that's what starts off this entire story. Also, I want to mention that this book is sapphic, and I absolutely loved that element of this book. I think it was just so amazing. It was really fun to like see this plot play out in like a sapphic way. It definitely reminded me a little bit of that movie What Happens in Vegas. I know in the book it says that it's like The Hangover, but it's not like The Hangover. I've seen The Hangover. This is nothing like The Hangover. This is What Happens in Vegas, featuring oh god, who is it? Ashton Kutcher and what's her face? Cameron Diaz. So that's the movie that I'm talking about. I'll put up a picture of it right now. But yeah, it was very reminiscent of What Happens in Vegas. Also kind of that other movie that I watched recently. Gosh, what is that movie called? Fools Rush In. Fools Rush In. Very similar to that one as well, right? Kind of. 3 months after a one-night stand with Isabel Fuentes in Las Vegas. Oh yeah, see, in Las Vegas, New York City real estate developer Alex Whitman learns that she is pregnant. Kind of similar. All has the same idea of being in Vegas, being drunk, hooking up. Stuff happens. Anyway, I loved this book. Honey Girl, absolutely gorgeous. The prose was so beautiful and so like flowery, but in like the best way possible. If you are not into flowery language, don't read this book. You're not gonna like it. But if you're like me and you like a bit of flowery language, some beautiful prose, 100% get into this book. It is so good. It was amazing. Loved it. Oh my gosh. All right, that was a lot of talking. Like my entire midsection, my diaphragm hurts so much. I am in pain. I definitely need to go rest for a little bit. I thought I was gonna film my TBR as well today, but that's not happening. No, absolutely not. I've been filming for the longest time. It's not gonna happen. So we're just gonna have to put off filming my TBR for tomorrow. But I hope you all enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed all the books that I read, my entire wrap up. It was a long one, I know. Hopefully next month won't be quite as long. I don't know if I can do 15 books again. That was a like marathon sprint to the end. I really loved all the books that I read, mostly. There were definitely some duds in there, but I think overall I had a really good reading month. Alright, so I hope you all enjoyed this video, and if you did, go ahead and give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Also go ahead and follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Goodreads, Storygraph, TikTok. All the links are going to be down below, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye! Ooh, I thought it'd be